As you and I are meeting now, there seems to have been some, for lack of a better word, decay in the overall peace process. We saw the U.S. administration saying this past week that a reassessment is necessary. Secretary of State Kerry bemoaned the fact that he felt neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians were doing what they had to do and make hard decisions to make the peace process go forward. And there's some sense that the White House now wants to reevaluate. May I ask, in general, even before this week, what was your view of the realistic possibility that this peace initiative would bear fruit, given what you've seen at the end of this past week as a United States Senator? How do you view it now?
Well, clearly it's a daunting task, and I applaud Secretary Kerry for the efforts that he's made. I think everyone, having listened to Prime Minister Netanyahu at his speech at AIPAC, outlined a vision of what a new Middle East could be, and it is a vision of peace, prosperity, stability with Israel and its neighbors, in which Israel could play a great role in creating economic development opportunities and greater stability for the region with its neighbors. But for that, you must have a partner for peace. And whether or not the time was propitious to move forward, there are certain elements to me that seem to be essential. Certainly, the Palestinian Authority and President Abbas are recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. Never has said that. And that is an essential element of moving forward. And then, of course, for Israel, it's security. And having visited Israel many times, and only by visiting there do you truly grab the magnitude of Israel's security challenge, with its back to the sea, surrounded by unfriendly neighbors, where you can go from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem on a good day in 45 minutes, or transverse its diameter on a flight in a couple of minutes. You understand its enormous challenges. And so I am incredibly disappointed to see that President Abbas has now gone back to the unilateral track at the UN. That is certainly undermines the peace process and the intentions. At the end of the day, I understand why the administration might want to take a reality check and decide whether or not there's anything more that can be done to move the process forward.
It's a pity, is it not?
It is, because obviously, you know, we don't know what will bloom from the Arab Spring. Some of us are worried that it will be a long winter of discontent. But we don't know what tomorrow brings, but we know what it could bring. And what it could bring is a totally different era for all of the people of the Middle East. So it is clearly unfortunate that the decision by the Palestinians to go the unilateral track, simply because the Israeli government will not release more prisoners without understanding whether there's still going to be a continuing effort towards a negotiated agreement in which those essential elements that Israel must have, recognizing a Palestinian state, we must recognize a Jewish state.
Mm-hmm. For you, there would be no compromising, and when I say compromising, what I mean is you do not feel that Mahmoud Abbas would be compromising his position if he acknowledged Israel as a Jewish state before negotiations. And that's the argument every now and then I hear. He shouldn't be asked to do this as a precondition. It seems to me that if there are two parties who honestly respect each other, it doesn't cost him anything to say, of course Israel is a Jewish state. At the same time, what I'm told is that should be a bargaining chip. How do you see it?
Well, you know, there are some things that in my mind are conditions precedent, and that is one. Israel will recognize a Palestinian state. Why is it impossible to recognize Israel as a Jewish state? And if you cannot have that fundamental understanding, how do you meet all the other challenges of security, economic development, representation, all of the things that are necessary? And, you know, at the same time, if Israel cannot have a commitment from its future neighbor to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, then peace is never fully obtained. And so there are many difficult questions that once that condition precedent is met, still must be met. But it creates a totally different paradigm under which those negotiations take place.
Very well said. Incidentally, how do you view Israeli settlements? There are those who criticize the settlement policy and who criticize the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, for even talking about or expanding settlement growth at this point in time. From your perspective, are settlements the obstacle to peace? If you were sitting, at a dinner, private dinner with the Israeli Prime Minister, would you say to him at this point in time, it would be better for you, even if Israel has the right, even if there's nothing illegal about the settlements, I wish Israel would take a lower profile on the settlements. What's your view?
Well, if you actually look at the pace of settlement construction, even though every settlement that is announced has a lot of fanfare and consequence, you see that actually the rate of construction is slower under the Netanyahu administration. And it's difficult for those who have a biblical and historical sense of Judea and Samaria about why can we not continue to have our attachment to our homeland. Now, in the path to peace, there are going to be difficult choices. Further construction will make it more difficult, but that's if you're already in a process in which you see a clear pathway for negotiation. If you have a partner in the Palestinian Authority that recognizes a Jewish state, then the dynamics move dramatically different.
There is overwhelming support for Israel in both houses of Congress. At the same time, Senator Menendez, you seem to have an especially sensitive understanding of Israel. And I wondered, where in the world does that come from in you? Where were you born?
I was born in the United States, but my family is from Cuba.
So at what point do you begin? When do you get it? How did that happen for you?
My first visit to Israel, it touched me deeply because, when I could go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, when I could go to Bethlehem, when I could go to all the Christian sites and be free to do so, and watch other religions be free to do so, which was not always the case, except for when Israel actually had jurisdiction over those areas, and the vibrant democracy that Israel is. So we, and I certainly, an admirer not just of the Jewish state, but of the Jewish people. I'm an admirer of battles won. I am an admirer of Nobel Prizes earned. I'm an admirer of enormous innovation. I'm an admirer of those who took the desert and made it green, and of the basic fundamental set of values that Israelis have in common with the United States. And so seeing Israel's physical challenges, seeing its vibrant democracy, seeing its commitment to the core values that we share in the United States, from that first visit, only reaffirmed from subsequent visits. That's where my foundation comes from.
That's a lovely story. All right, I can't be sitting with you and not ask you to talk about Iran. And no one has given as much energy as you have to the idea that it is important to keep sanctions on Iran. I don't know how you feel about the fact that the administration rolled the sanctions back. I don't know how you feel about how Iran has handled itself in this last 6-month period, 8-month period, whatever it is. But I would like a sense from you now where you see the entire Western American-led effort to keep Iran from going nuclear in terms of nuclear weapons, and what you think you will be able to have happen in the United States Senate and in Congress when it comes to sanctions on Iran.
Well, Mark, this is something I've been dealing with for 20 years. When I was in the House of Representatives on the House International Relations Committee at the time, as it was called, I found out that U.S. voluntary contributions above and beyond our membership dues to the International Atomic Energy Administration were being used for what? To create operational capacity at the Bushehr nuclear facility. And I said, oh my God, not in the national interest of the United States or its security, not in the national interest or security of our ally, the State of Israel. And I led a successful fight to end those voluntary contributions. And I consistently raised with my friends in the community and those beyond who cared about the Middle East that we should be paying far more attention to Iran because of what their desire and where they're headed. And I was, by many, I was told, no, you've lost your central focus. I wish that they had been right and I had been wrong. Now, the existential threat to the State of Israel, a national security threat to the United States, should Iran acquire nuclear weapons, is very real. And as someone who has been the author of every major sanctions legislation that has become law in the Senate, I want to see the diplomatic process be achieved, but not a deal for a deal's sake. It must be a deal that dismantles Iran's illicit nuclear program. It must be one that makes it incapable of producing even one nuclear bomb. And so I am concerned that the international community is more interested in getting an agreement than a good and right agreement. And so as a result, I believe time is on the Iranian side, not ours. Because as time continues to move forward, the whole sanctions regime that we have put together internationally, while still intact, has pressures on it because of the belief of the business community, wherever they may be situated, that I want to get there first. And so you see these trade delegations going to Tehran. No deals yet, as far as we can tell, but the pressure is there. And Rouhani is using it very well to his advantage. And then also, the research and development capacity has not been stopped as part of the interim agreement. And so for as long as time continues to move by without an agreement that we would accept that would dismantle Iran's illicit nuclear program, as called for not just by the U.S., but in UN Security Council resolutions and others, then the Iranians continue to use their R&D. They create centrifuges of greater capability, which means it reduces the time for their ability to cross the threshold, which is already at a very short period of time. And they get some sanctions relief, but even more importantly, they continue to pressure the international sanctions regime that already exists. All of that is not a good program. So I have remained vigilant, and as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, will continue to drive that any potential agreement that we might get into must be an agreement that has a series of important standards. It must dismantle Iran's illicit nuclear program. It must create an environment and a capability in which any re-engagement by the Iranians will set off alarm bells, as I will say here in a little while, from Vienna to Tel Aviv to Washington in the next 10 or 20 years, that will ultimately not undo sanctions unless we see a march towards a verifiable dismantling of that illicit activity, and that also deals with questions like the Iraq heavy water reactor, that deals with the weaponization aspects of Iran's interests, that deals with its Parchin site. There's a lot of elements here that have to be dealt with. And so I'm hopeful that the international community, the P5+1, can get to a verifiable, good agreement that does exactly what I'd like to see. But I'm not optimistic when I see the Iranians' #1 history of obfuscation and dilatory tactics that have brought them to the precipice of where some say you have to give them some level of enrichment, even if it's not for the potential for a nuclear bomb. Or where we continue to see their promotion of terrorism abroad, their daily sending of troops and individuals and weapons into Syria. They're, sending us an ambassador who was part at the United Nations, who was part of a group of students with reference to the hostage taking at the American embassy. So I look at all of their actions, notwithstanding the smiles across the negotiating table, and I am concerned about where we are headed. And I will keep the vigilance of the committee and try to safeguard the very sanctions regime we created.